The Nightly Quest of Mervyn by P.G. Wodehouse. Some sort of smoking concert seemed to be in progress in the large room across the passage from the bar parlour of the Angler's Rest, and a music-loving stout and mild had left the door open, the better to enjoy the entertainment. By this means we had been privileged to hear Kipling's Mandalay, I'll Sing These Songs of Araby, The Midshipmite, and Ho, Jolly Jenkin. And now the piano began to tinkle again, and a voice broke into a less familiar number. The words came to us faintly, but dearly. The days of chivalry are dead, of which in stories I have read when knights were bold and acted kind of scrappy. They used to take a lot of pains and fight all day to please the Janes, and if their dame was tickled they was happy. But now the men are mild and meek. They seem to have a yellow streak. They never lay for other guys to flatten 'em. They think they've done a darn fine thing if they just buy the girl a ring of imitation diamonds and platinum. Oh, it makes me sort of sad to think about Sir Galahad and all the knights of that romantic day. To amuse a girl and charm her, they would climb into their armour and jump into the fray. They called her Lady Love. They used to wear her little glove, and everything that she said went, for those were the days when a lady was a lady and a gent was a perfect gent. A ninepennyworth of sherry sighed. "True," he murmured, "very true." The singer continued. Some night when they sat down to dine, Sir Claude would say, "That girl of mine makes every woman jealous when she sees her." Then someone else would shout, "Behave, thou malapert and scurvy knave, or I will smite thee one upon the beezer." And then next morning in the lists they'd take their lances in their fists and mount a pair of chargers, highly metalled. And when Sir Claude, so fair and young, got punctured in the leg or lung, they looked upon the argument as settled. The ninepennyworth of sherry sighed again. "He's right," he said. "We live in degenerate days, gentlemen. Where now is the fine old tradition of derring-do?" "Where?" demanded the ninepennyworth of sherry with modest fervour. "Shall we find in these prosaic modern times the spirit that made the knights of old go through perilous adventures and brave dreadful dangers to do their lady's behest?" "In the Mulliner family," said Mr. Mulliner, pausing for a moment from the sipping of his hot scotch and lemon, "in the clan to which I have the honour to belong, the spirit to which you allude still flourishes in all its pristine vigour. I can scarcely exemplify this better than by relating the story of my cousin's son, Mervyn, and the strawberries." "But I want to listen to the concert," pleaded a rum and milk. "I just heard the curate clear his throat. That always means dangerous Dan McGrew." "The story," repeated Mr. Mulliner with quiet firmness as he closed the door, "of my cousin's son, Mervyn, and the strawberries." "In the circles in which the two moved," said Mr. Mulliner, "it had often been debated whether my cousin's son, Mervyn, was a bigger chump than my nephew Archibald, the one who, if you recall, was so good at imitating a hen laying an egg. Some took one side, some the other, but, though the point still lies open, there is no doubt that young Mervyn was quite a big enough chump for everyday use. And it was this quality in him that deterred Clarice Mallaby from consenting to become his bride. He discovered this one night when, as they were dancing at the Restless Cheese, he put the thing squarely up to her, not mincing his words. "Tell me, Clarice," he said, "why is it that you spurn a fellow's suit? I can't for the life of me see why you won't consent to marry a chap. It isn't as if I hadn't asked you often enough. Playing fast and loose with a good man's love is the way I look at it." And he gazed at her in a way that was partly melting and partly suggestive of the dominant male. And Clarice Mallaby gave one of those light, tinkling laughs and replied, "Well, if you really want to know, you're such an ass." Mervyn could make nothing of this. "An ass? How do you mean an ass? Do you mean a silly ass?" "I mean a goof," said the girl. "A gump, a poop, a nitwit, and a returned empty. Your name came up the other day in the course of conversation at home, and Mother said you were a vapid and irreflective guffin, totally lacking in character and purpose." "Oh," said Mervyn. "She did she?" "She did. And while it isn't often that I think along the same lines as Mother there, for once, I consider her to have hit the bull's-eye, rung the bell, and to be entitled to a cigar or cocoa nut according to choice." It seemed to me what they call the mot juste. Indeed, said Mervyn, nettled. Well, let me tell you something. When it comes to discussing brains, your mother, in my opinion, would do better to recede modestly into the background and not try to set herself up as an authority. I strongly suspect her of being the woman who was seen in Charing Cross Station the other day, asking a potter if he could direct her to Charing Cross Station. And in the second place, said Mervyn, I'll show you if I haven't got character and purpose. Set me some quest, like the knights of old, and see how quick I'll deliver the goods as per esteemed order. How do you mean, a quest? Why, bid me do something for you, or get something for you, or buff somebody in the eye for you. You know the procedure. Clarice thought for a moment. Then she said, All my life I've wanted to eat strawberries in the middle of winter. Get me a basket of strawberries before the end of the month, and we'll take up this matrimonial proposition of yours in a spirit of serious research. Strawberries, said Mervyn. Strawberries. Mervyn gulped a little. Strawberries? But I say, dash it, strawberries. Strawberries, said Clarice. And then at last Mervyn, reading between the lines, saw that what she wanted was strawberries, and how he was to get any in December was more than he could have told you. I could do you oranges, he said. Strawberries. Or nuts. You wouldn't prefer a nice nut? Strawberries, said the girl firmly. And you're jolly lucky, my lad, not to be sent off after the Holy Grail or something, or told to pluck me a sprig of edelweiss from the top of the Alps. Mind you, I'm not saying yes and I'm not saying no, but this I will say, that if you bring me that basket of strawberries in the stated time, I shall know that there's more in you than sawdust, which the casual observer wouldn't believe. And I will reopen your case and examine it thoroughly in the light of the fresh evidence, whereas if you fail to deliver the fruit, I shall know that Mother was right, and you can jolly well make up your mind to doing without my society from now on. Here she stopped to take in breath, and Mervyn, after a lengthy pause, braced himself up and managed to utter a brave laugh. It was a little roupy, if not actually hacking, but he did it. Right-ho, he said. Right-ho. If that's the way you feel, well, to put it in a nutshell, right-ho. My cousin's son Mervyn passed a restless night that night, tossing on the pillow not a little, and feverishly at that. If this girl had been a shade less attractive, he told himself, he would have sent her a telegram telling her to go to the dickens. But, as it so happened, she was not. So the only thing that remained for him to do was to pull up the old socks and take a stab at the programme, as outlined. And he was sipping his morning cup of tea, when something more or less resembling an idea came to him. He reasoned thus. The wise man, finding himself in a dilemma, consults an expert. If, for example, some knotty point of the law has arisen, he will proceed immediately in search of a legal expert, bring out his 8 and 6, and put the problem up to him. If it is a crossword puzzle, and he is stuck for the word in 3 letters, beginning with E and ending with U and meaning large Australian bird, he places the matter in the hands of the editor of the Encyclopaedia Britannica. And similarly, when the question confronting him is how to collect strawberries in December, the best plan is obviously to seek out that one of his acquaintances who has the most established reputation for giving expensive parties. This, Mervyn considered, was beyond a doubt Ufi Prosser. Thinking back, he could recall a dozen occasions when he had met chorus girls groping their way along the street with a dazed look in their eyes, and when he had asked them what the matter was, they had explained that they were merely living over again the exotic delights of the party Ufi Prosser had given last night. If anybody knew how to get strawberries in December, it would be Ufi. He called accordingly at the latter's apartment and found him in bed, staring at the ceiling and moaning in an undertone. "Hello," said Mervyn. "You look a bit red-eyed, old corpse." "I feel red-eyed," said Ufi, "and I wish, if it isn't absolutely necessary, that you wouldn't come charging in here early in the morning like this. By about 10 o'clock tonight, I imagine, if I take great care of myself and keep quite quiet, I shall once more be in a position to look at gargoyles without wincing, but at the moment the mere sight of your horrible face gives me an indefinable, shuddering feeling." "Did you have a party last night?" "I did. I wonder if by any chance you had strawberries." Ufi Prosser gave a sort of quiver and shut his eyes. He seemed to be wrestling with some powerful emotion. Then the spasm passed, and he spoke. "Don't talk about the beastly things," he said. "I never want to see strawberries again in my life, nor lobster, caviar, pâté de foie gras, prawns in aspic, or anything remotely resembling Bronx cocktails, martinis, sidecars, lizards' breaths, all quiet on the western fronts, and any variety of champagne, whiskey, brandy, chartreuse, Benedictine, and curaçoa." Mervyn nodded sympathetically. "I know just how you feel, old man," he said, "and I hate to have to press the point, but I happen, for purposes which I will not reveal, to require about a dozen strawberries." "Then go and buy them, blast you," said Ufi, turning his face to the wall. "Can you buy strawberries in December?" "Certainly. Bellamy's in Piccadilly have them." "Are they frightfully expensive?" asked Mervyn, feeling in his pocket and fingering the £1, 2 shillings and 3 pence, which had got to last him to the end of the quarter when his allowance came in. "Do they cost a fearful lot?" "Of course not. They're dirt cheap." Mervyn heaved a relieved sigh. "I don't suppose I pay more than £1 apiece, or at most 30 shillings for mine," said Ufi. "You can get quite a lot for 50 quid. Mervyn uttered a hollow groan. "Don't gargle," said Ufi. "Or if you must gargle, gargle outside." 50 quid, said Mervyn. 50 or 100, I forget which. My man attends to these things. Mervyn looked at him in silence. He was trying to decide whether the moment had arrived to put Ufi into circulation. In the matter of borrowing money, my cousin's son, Mervyn, was shrewd and level-headed. He had vision. At an early date he had come to the conclusion that it would be foolish to fritter away a fellow like Ufi in a series of 10 bobs and quids. The prudent man, he felt, when he has an Ufi Prosser on his list, nurses him along till he feels the time is ripe for one of those quick "send me 200 by messenger, old man, or my head goes in the gas oven" touches. For years, accordingly, he had been saving Ufi up for some really big emergency. And the point he had to decide was, would there ever be a bigger emergency than this? That was what he asked himself. Then it came home to him that Ufi was not in the mood. The way it seemed to Mervyn was that if Ufi's mother had crept to Ufi's bedside at this moment and tried to mace him for as much as 5 bob, Ufi would have risen and struck her with the bromo seltzer bottle. With a soft sigh, therefore, he gave up the idea and oozed out of the room and downstairs into Piccadilly. Piccadilly looked pretty mouldy to Mervyn. It was full, he tells me, of people and other foul things. He wandered along for a while in a distrait way, and then suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, he became aware that he was in the presence of fruit. A shop on the starboard side was full of it, and he discovered that he was standing outside Bellamy's. And what is more there, nestling in a basket in the middle of a lot of cotton wool and blue paper, was a platoon of strawberries. And as he gazed at them, Mervyn began to see how this thing could be worked with the minimum of discomfort and the maximum of profit to all concerned. He had just remembered that his maternal uncle Joseph had an account at Bellamy's. The next moment he had bounded through the door and was in conference with one of the reduced duchesses who do the fruit selling at this particular emporium. This one, Mervyn tells me, was about 6 feet high and looked down at him with large, haughty eyes in a derogatory manner, being, among other things, dressed from stem to stern in black satin. He was conscious of a slight chill, but he carried on according to plan. "Good morning," he said, switching on a smile, and then switching it off again as he caught her eye. "Do you sell fruit?" If she had answered no, he would of course have been nonplussed, but she did not. She inclined her head proudly. "Quite," she said. "That's fine," said Mervyn heartily, "because fruit happens to be just what I'm after." "Quite. I want that basket of strawberries in the window." "Quite." She reached for them and started to wrap them up. She did not seem to enjoy doing it. As she tied the string, her brooding look deepened. Mervyn thinks she may have had some great love tragedy in her life. "Send them to the Earl of Blotsam, 66A, Berkeley Square," said Mervyn, alluding to his maternal uncle Joseph. "Quite. On second thoughts," said Mervyn, "no, I'll take them with me. Save trouble, hand them over and send the bill to Lord Blotsam." This, naturally, was the crux or nub of the whole enterprise. And to Mervyn's concern, his suggestion did not seem to have met with the ready acceptance for which he had hoped. He had looked for the bright smile, the courteous inclination of the head, instead of which the girl looked doubtful. "You desire to remove them in person?" "Quite," said Mervyn. "Pardon me," said the girl, suddenly disappearing. She was not away long. In fact, Mervyn, roaming hither and thither about the shop, had barely had time to eat 3 or 4 dates and a custard apple when she was with him once more. And now she was wearing a look of definite disapproval, like a duchess who has found half a caterpillar in the castle salad. "His lordship informs me that he desires no strawberries." "Eh?" "I have been in telephonic communication with his lordship, and he states explicitly that he does not desire strawberries." Mervyn gave a little at the knees, but he came back stoutly. "Don't you listen to what he says," he urged. "He's always kidding. That's the sort of fellow he is. Just a great big happy schoolboy. Of course he desires strawberries. He told me so himself. I'm his nephew." Good stuff, he felt, but it did not seem to be getting over. He caught a glimpse of the girl's face, and it was definitely cold and hard and proud. However, he gave a careless laugh, just to show that his heart was in the right place, and seized the basket. "Ha, ha, ha!" he tittered lightly, and started for the street at something midway between a saunter and a gallop. And he had not more than reached the open spaces when he heard the girl give tongue behind him. "Ee, ee, ee," she said in substance. Now, you must remember that all this took place round about the hour of noon, when every young fellow is at his lowest and weakest, and the need for the 12 o'clock bracer has begun to sap his morale pretty considerably. With a couple of quick cold ones under his vest, Mervyn would no doubt have faced the situation and carried it off with an air. He would have raised his eyebrows. He would have been nonchalant and lit a murad. But, coming on him in his reduced condition, this fearful screech unnerved him completely. The Duchess had now begun to cry, "Stop thief!" And Mervyn, most injudiciously, instead of keeping his head and leaping carelessly into a passing taxi, made the grave strategic error of picking up his feet with a jerk and starting to run along Piccadilly. Well, naturally that did him no good at all. 800 people appeared from nowhere, willing hands gripped his collar and the seat of his trousers, and the next thing he knew he was cooling off in Vine Street police station. After that, everything was more or less of a blur. The scene seemed suddenly to change to a police court in which he was confronted by a magistrate who looked like an owl, with a dash of weasel blood in him. A dialogue then took place, of which all he recalls is this: "Policeman, hearing cries of 'Stop thief, your worship,' and observing the accused running very arty, I apprehended him. Magistrate, how did he appear when apprehended? Policeman, very apprehensive, your worship. Magistrate, you mean he had a sort of pinched look?" Laughter in court. Policeman, it then transpired that he'd been attempting to purloin strawberries. Magistrate, he seems to have got the raspberry. Laughter in court. Well, what have you to say, young man? Mervyn. Magistrate. More. I fear. Laughter in court, in which his worship joined. £10 or 14 days. Well, you can see how extremely unpleasant this must have been for my cousin's son. Considered purely from the dramatic angle, the magistrate had played him right off the stage, hogging all the comedy and getting the sympathy of the audience from the start. And apart from that, here he was, nearing the end of the quarter, with all his allowance spent except £1, 2 and 3pence, suddenly called upon to pay £10 or go to durance vile for a matter of 2 weeks. There was only one course before him. His sensitive soul revolted at the thought of languishing in a dungeon for a solid fortnight, so it was imperative that he raise the cash somewhere. And the only way of raising it that he could think of was to apply to his uncle, Lord Blotsam. So he sent a messenger round to Berkeley Square, explaining that he was in jail and hoping his uncle was the same, and presently a letter was brought back by the butler, containing £10 in postal orders, the curse of the Blotsams, a third-class ticket to Blotsam Regis in Shropshire, and instructions that, as soon as they smote the fetters from his wrists, he was to take the first train there and go and stay at Blotsam Castle till further notice. Because at the castle, his uncle said in a powerful passage, even a blasted, pimply, pop-eyed, good-for-nothing scallywag and nincompoop like his nephew couldn't get into mischief and disgrace the family name. And in this, Mervyn tells me, there was a good deal of rugged sense. Blotsam Castle, a noble pile, is situated at least 6 miles from anywhere, and the only time anybody ever succeeded in disgracing the family name while in residence was back in the reign of Edward the Confessor, when the then Earl of Blotsam, having lured a number of neighbouring landowners into the banqueting hall on the specious pretence of standing the mulled sack, had proceeded to murder one and all with a battle-axe, subsequently cutting their heads off and, in rather loud taste, sticking them on spikes along the outer battlements. So Mervyn went down to Blotsam Regis and started to camp at the castle. And it was not long, he tells me, before he began to find the time hanging a little heavy on his hands. For a couple of days he managed to endure the monotony, occupying himself in carving the girl's initials on the immemorial elms with a heart round them. But on the third morning, having broken his Boy Scout pocket-knife, he was at something of a loose end. And to fill in the time, he started on a moody stroll through the Messuages and Pleasances, feeling a good deal cast down. After pacing hither and thither for a while, thinking of the girl Clarice, he came to a series of hothouses, and it being extremely cold, with an east wind that went through his +4s like a javelin, he thought it would make an agreeable change if he were to go inside where it was warm and smoke 2 or perhaps 3 cigarettes. And scarcely had he got past the door when he found he was almost entirely surrounded by strawberries. There they were, scores of them, all hot and juicy. For a moment, he tells me, Mervyn had a sort of idea that a miracle had occurred. He seemed to remember a similar thing having happened to the Israelites in the desert. That time, he reminded me, when they were all saying to each other how well a spot of manna would go down, and what a dashed shame it was they hadn't any manna, and that was the slipshod way the commissariat department ran things, and they wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't a case of graft in high places. And then suddenly, out of a blue sky, all the manna they could do with, and enough over for breakfast next day. Well, to be brief, that was the view which Mervyn took of the matter in the first flush of his astonishment. Then he remembered that his uncle always opened the castle for the Christmas festivities, and these strawberries were, no doubt, intended for Exhibit A at some forthcoming rout or merry-making. Well, after that, of course, everything was simple. A child would have known what to do. Hastening back to the house, Mervyn returned with a cardboard box, and keeping a keen eye out for the head gardener, hurried in, selected about 24 of the finest specimens, placed them in the box, ran back to the house again, reached for the railway guide, found that there was a train leaving for London in an hour, changed into town clothes, seized his top hat, borrowed the stable boy's bicycle, pedalled to the station, and about 4 hours later was mounting the front door steps of Clarice Malaby's house in Eaton Square with the box tucked under his arm. No, that is wrong. The box was not actually tucked under his arm because he had left it in the train. Except for that, he had carried the thing through without a hitch. Sturdy common sense is always a quality of the Mulliners, even of the less mentally gifted of the family. It was obvious to Mervyn that no useful end was to be gained by ringing the bell and rushing into the girl's presence, shouting, "See what I've brought you?" On the other hand, what to do? He was feeling somewhat unequal to the swirl of events. Once, he tells me, some years ago, he got involved in some amateur theatricals to play the role of a butler, and his part consisted of the following lines and business. Enter Jorkins, carrying telegram on salver. Jorkins, a telegram, my lady. Exit Jorkins. And on the night in he came full of confidence and, having said, "A telegram, my lady," extended an empty salver towards the heroine, who, having been expecting on the strength of the telegram to clutch at her heart and say, "My God," and tear open the envelope and crush it in nervous fingers and fall over in a swoon, was considerably taken aback, not to say perturbed. He felt now as he had felt then. Still, he had enough sense left to see the way out. After a couple of turns up and down the south side of Eaton Square, he came, rather shrewdly I must confess, to the conclusion that the only person who could help him in this emergency was Prosser. The way Mervyn sketched out the scenario in the rough, it all looked pretty plain sailing. He would go to whom, as I told you, he had been saving up for years, and with one single impressive gesture, get into his ribs for about 20 quid. He would be losing money on the deal, of course, because he had always had scheduled for at least 50, but that could not be helped. Then off to Bellamy's and buy strawberries. He did not exactly relish the prospect of meeting the black satin girl again, but when love is calling, these things have to be done. He found at home and plunged into the agenda without delay. "Hello, old man," he said. "How are you, old man? I say, old man, I do like that tie you're wearing, what I call something like a tie. Quite the snappiest thing I've seen for years and years and years and years. I wish I could get ties like that, but then, of course, I haven't your exquisite taste. What I've always said about you, old man, and what I always will say, is that you have the most extraordinary flair. It amounts to genius in the selection of ties. But then one must bear in mind that anything would look well on you because you have such a clean-cut virile profile. I met a man the other day who said to me, I didn't know Ronald Coleman was in England. And I said, he isn't. And he said, but I saw you talking to him outside the Blotto Kitten. And I said, that wasn't Ronald Coleman. That was my old pal. The best pal any man ever had, Prosser. And he said, well, I never saw such a remarkable resemblance. And I said, yes, there is a great resemblance, only, of course, is much the better looking. And this fellow said, Prosser? Is that the Prosser, the man whose name you hear everywhere? And I said, yes, and I'm proud to call him my friend. I don't suppose, I said, there's another fellow in London in such demand. Duchesses clamour for him, and if you ask a princess to dinner, you have to add, to meet Prosser, or she won't come. This, I explained, is because in addition to being the handsomest and best-dressed man in Mayfair, he is famous for his sparkling wit and keen, but always kindly, repartee. And yet, in spite of all, he remains simple, unspoilt, unaffected. Will you lend me 20 quid, old man? No, said Prosser. Mervyn paled. What did you say? I said no? No? And Ruddy? Oh, said firmly. Mervyn clutched at the mantelpiece. But old man, I need the money, need it sorely. I don't care. It seemed to Mervyn that the only thing to do was to tell all. Clearing his throat, he started in at the beginning. He sketched the course of his great love in burning words and brought the story up to the point where the girl had placed her order for strawberries. She must be cuckoo, said Prosser. Mervyn was respectful but firm. She isn't cuckoo, he said. I have felt all along that the incident showed what a spiritual nature she has. I mean to say, reaching out yearningly for the unattainable and all that sort of thing, if you know what I mean. Anyway, the broad basic point is that she wants strawberries, and I've got to collect enough money to get her them. Who is this half-wit? Asked Mervyn told him, and seemed rather impressed. I know her, he mused a while. Dashed pretty girl. Lovely, said Mervyn. What eyes? Yes. What hair? Yes. What a figure? Yes, said I always think she's one of the prettiest girls in London. Absolutely, said Mervyn. Then, on second thoughts, old pal, you'll lend me 20 quid to buy her strawberries? No, said And Mervyn could not shift him. In the end, he gave it up. Very well, he said. Oh, very well. If you won't, you won't. But Alexander Prosser, proceeded Mervyn with a good deal of dignity, just let me tell you this. I wouldn't be seen dead in a tie like that beastly thing you're wearing. I don't like your profile. Your hair is getting thin on the top. And I heard a certain prominent society hostess say the other day that the great drawback to living in London was that a woman couldn't give so much as the simplest luncheon party without suddenly finding that that appalling man Prosser, I quote her words, had wriggled out of the woodwork and was in her midst. Prosser, I wish you a very good afternoon. Brave words, of course, but when you came right down to it, they could not be said to have got him anywhere. After the first thrill of telling what he thought of him had died away, Mervyn realised that his quandary was now greater than ever. Where was he to look for aid and comfort? He had friends, of course, but the best of them wasn't good for more than an occasional drink or possibly a couple of quid. And what use was that to a man who needed at least a dozen strawberries at £1 apiece? Extremely bleak the world looked to my cousin's unfortunate son, and he was in sombre mood as he wandered along Piccadilly. As he surveyed the passing populace, he suddenly realised, he tells me, what these Bolshevist blokes were driving at. They had spotted, as he had spotted now, that what was wrong with the world was that all the cash seemed to be centred in the wrong hands and needed a lot of broad-minded redistribution. Where money was concerned, he perceived, merit counted for nothing. Money was too apt to be collared by some rotten bounder or bounders, while the good and deserving man was left standing on the outside looking in. The sight of all those expensive cars rolling along, crammed to the bulwarks with overfed males and females with fur coats and double chins, made him feel, he tells me, that he wanted to buy a red tie and a couple of bombs and start the social revolution. If Stalin had come along at that moment, Mervyn would have shaken him by the hand. Well, there is, of course, only one thing for a young man to do when he feels like that. Mervyn hurried along to the club and in rapid succession drank 3 martini cocktails. The treatment was effective, as it always is. Gradually, the stern, censorious mood passed, and he began to feel an optimistic glow. As the revivers slid over the larynx, he saw that all was not lost. He perceived that he had been leaving out of his reckoning that sweet, angelic pity which is such a characteristic of woman. Take the case of a knight of old, he meant to say. Was anyone going to tell him that if a knight of old had been sent off by a damsel on some fearfully tricky quest and had gone through all sorts of perils and privations for her sake, facing dragons in black satin and risking going to chokey and what not, the girl would have given him the bird when he got back, simply because, looking at the matter from a severely technical standpoint, he had failed to bring home the gravy? Absolutely not, Mervyn considered. She would have been most awfully braced with him for putting up such a good show, and would have comforted and cosseted him. This girl, Clarice, he felt, was bound to do the same, so obviously the move now was to toddle along to Eaton Square again and explain matters to her. So he gave his hat a brush, flicked a spot of dust from his coat sleeve, and shot off in a taxi. All during the drive he was rehearsing what he would say to her, and it sounded pretty good to him. In his mind's eye he could see the tears coming into her gentle eyes as he told her about the arm of the law gripping his trouser seat. But when he arrived, a hitch occurred. There was a stage wait. The butler at Eaton Square told him the girl was dressing. "Say that Mr. Mulliner has called," said Mervyn. So the butler went upstairs, and presently from a loft there came the clear, penetrating voice of his loved one, telling the butler to bung Mr. Mulliner into the drawing-room and lock up all the silver. And Mervyn went into the drawing-room and settled down to wait. It was one of those drawing-rooms where there is not a great deal to entertain and amuse the visitor. Mervyn tells me that he got a good laugh out of a photograph of the girl's late father on the mantelpiece, a heavily whiskered old gentleman who reminded him of a burst horsehair sofa. But the rest of the appointments were on the dull side. They consisted of an album of views of Italy and a copy of Indian love lyrics bound in limp cloth. And it was not long before he began to feel a touch of ennui. He polished his shoes with one of the sofa cushions and took his hat from the table where he had placed it and gave it another brush. But after that there seemed to be nothing in the way of intellectual occupation offering itself, so he just leaned back in a chair and unhinged his lower jaw and let it droop and sank into a sort of coma. And it was while he was still in this trance that he was delighted to hear a dogfight in progress in the street. He went to the window and looked out, but the thing was apparently taking place somewhere near the front door, and the top of the porch hid it from him. Now Mervyn hated to miss a dogfight. Many of his happiest hours had been spent at dogfights, and this one appeared from the sound of it to be on a more or less major scale. He ran down the stairs and opened the front door. As his trained senses had told him, the encounter was being staged at the foot of the steps. He stood in the open doorway and drank it in. He had always maintained that you got the best dogfights down in the Eaton Square neighbourhood, because there tough animals from the King's Road, Chelsea district were apt to wander in. Dogs who had trained on gin and flat irons at the local public houses and could be relied on to give of their best. The present encounter bore out this view. It was between a sort of consommé of Mastiff and Irish Terrier on the one hand, and on the other a long-haired Macedonian of about 7 breeds of dog, who had an indescribable raffish look, as if he had been mixing with the artist colony down by the river. For about 5 minutes it was as inspiring a contest as you could have wished to see. But at the end of that time it stopped suddenly, both principals simultaneously observing a cat at an area gate down the road, and shaking hands hastily and woofing after her. Mervyn was not a little disappointed at this abrupt conclusion to the entertainment, but it was no use repining. He started to go back into the house and was just closing the front door when a messenger boy appeared carrying a parcel. "Sign, please," said the messenger boy. The lad's mistake was a natural one. Finding Mervyn standing in the doorway without a hat, he had assumed him to be the butler. He pushed the parcel into his hand, made him sign a yellow paper, and went off, leaving Mervyn with the parcel. And Mervyn, glancing at it, saw that it was addressed to the girl, Clarice. But it was not this that made him reel where he stood. What made him reel where he stood was the fact that on the paper outside the thing was a label with Bellamy and Company, bespoke fruitists on it. And he was convinced, prodding it, that there was some squashy substance inside, which certainly was not apples, oranges, nuts, bananas, or anything of that nature. Mervyn lowered his shapely nose and gave a good hard sniff at the parcel, and having done so, he reeled where he stood once more. A frightful suspicion had shot through him. It was not that my cousin's son was gifted beyond the ordinary in the qualities that go to make a successful detective. You would not have found him deducing anything much from footprints or cigar ash. In fact, if this parcel had contained cigar ash, it would have meant nothing to him. But in the circumstances, anybody with his special knowledge would have been suspicious. For consider the facts. His sniff had told him that beneath the outward wrapping of paper lay strawberries, and the only person beside himself who knew that the girl wanted strawberries was Oofy Prosser. About the only man in London able to buy strawberries at that time of year was Oofy. And Oofy's manner, he recalled, when they were talking about the girl's beauty and physique generally, had been furtive and sinister. To rip open the paper, therefore, and take a look at the enclosed card was with Mervyn Mulliner the work of a moment. And sure enough, it was as he had foreseen. Alexander C. Prosser was the name on the card, and Mervyn tells me he wouldn't be a bit surprised if the C didn't stand for Clarence. His first feeling, he tells me, as he stood there staring at that card, was one of righteous indignation at the thought that any such treacherous, double-crossing hound as Oofy Prosser should have been permitted to pollute the air of London W1 all these years. To refuse a fellow 20 quid with one hand, and then to go and send his girl strawberries with the other, struck Mervyn as about as low down a bit of hornswoggling as you could want. He burned with honest wrath. And he was still burning when the last cocktail he had had at the club, which had been lying low inside him all this while, suddenly came to life and got action. Quite unexpectedly, he tells me, it began to frisk about like a young lamb, until it leaped into his head and gave him the idea of a lifetime. What, he asked himself, was the matter with suppressing this card, freezing onto the berries, and presenting them to the girl with a modest flourish as coming from M. Mulliner, Esquire? And, he answered himself, there was abso-bally nothing the matter with it. It was a jolly sound scheme and showed what 3 medium dry martinis could do. He quivered all over with joy and elation. Standing there in the hall, he felt that there was a providence after all, which kept an eye on good men, and saw to it that they came out on top in the end. In fact, he felt so extremely elated that he burst into song. And he had not got much beyond the first high note when he heard Clarice Mallaby giving tongue from upstairs. "Stop it! What did you say?" said Mervyn. I said, "Stop it! The cat's downstairs with a headache trying to rest." "I say," said Mervyn, "are you going to be long?" "How do you mean, long?" "Long dressing, because I've something I want to show you." "What?" "Oh, nothing much," said Mervyn carelessly. "Nothing particular, just a few assorted strawberries." "Eek," said the girl. "You don't mean you've really got them?" "Got them?" said Mervyn. "Didn't I say I would?" "I'll be down in just 1 minute," said the girl. Well, you know what girls are. The minute stretched into 5 minutes, and the 5 minutes into a quarter of an hour, and Mervyn made the tour of the drawing-room and looked at the photograph of her late father, and picked up the album of Views of Italy, and opened Indian love lyrics at page 43, and shut it again, and took up the cushion, and gave his shoes another rub, and brushed his hat once more, and still she didn't come. And so, by way of something else to do, he started brooding on the strawberries for a space. Considered purely as strawberries, he tells me, they were a pretty rickety collection, not to say spavined. They were an unhealthy whitish pink in colour, and looked as if they had just come through a lingering illness which had involved a good deal of bloodletting by means of leeches. "They don't look much," said Mervyn to himself. Not that it really mattered, of course, because all the girl had told him to do was to get her strawberries, and nobody could deny that these were strawberries. C3, though they might be, they were genuine strawberries, and from that fact there was no getting away. Still, he did not want the dear little soul to be disappointed. "I wonder if they have any flavour at all," said Mervyn to himself. Well, the first one had not, nor had the second. The third was rather better, and the fourth was quite juicy. And the best of all, oddly enough, was the last one in the basket. He was just finishing it when Clarice Mallaby came running in. Well, Mervyn tried to pass it off, of course, but his efforts were not rewarded with any great measure of success. In fact, he tells me that he did not get beyond a tentative, "Oh, I say." And the upshot of the whole matter was that the girl threw him out into the winter evening without so much as giving him a chance to take his hat. Nor had he the courage to go back and fetch it later, for Clarice Mallaby stated specifically that if he dared to show his ugly face at the house again, the butler had instructions to knock him down and skin him, and the butler was looking forward to it, as he had never liked Mervyn. So there the matter rests. The whole thing has been a great blow to my cousin's son, for he considers, and rightly I suppose, that, if you really come down to it, he failed in his quest. Nevertheless, I think that we must give him credit for the possession of the old knightly spirit to which our friend here was alluding just now. He meant well. He did his best. And even of a Mulliner, more cannot be said than that.